Promise. Oh my gosh.
Well, in keeping with today's theme, our scripture today was from the prophet Jeremiah, and it's one of the interesting writings from the prophets that it specifically says this is these words captured here were a letter sent by the prophet or thereabouts, and captured and shared with the exiles in Babylon. I'm not a historian, an Old Testament historian. I can't tell you the much more than that, other than in my research, I know that this is all about the 6th century BC, 587 or thereabouts in that time frame. There's the writings of Jeremiah span a period of time, but that puts us in the early part of the 6th century BC. And a letter intended to offer words of comfort and hope, even though they were hard to hear, because as I said this morning in worship, which I think all but maybe Vernita had a chance to hear, the words were be patient. Things aren't going to change quickly. You're in this for the long haul, so much so that get established in Babylon. Get your families squared away. Take care of setting up the coming generations. God's plan, which is the verse that people so love from Jeremiah, that the Lord knows His plans for you. That plan pre-exists this experience. God's vision for the world pre-exists this exile, and subsequently also continues on. And so that's our message of hope today. Hopefully, and that came in the form of a letter. Now we know that the ancients, and in particular, that correspondence, was the earliest form of keeping connected with people when you were physically separated, and the importance of that kind of correspondence, which took a variety of forms and shapes, really shaped history. And the good news is people treasured this correspondence so much that they kept it, and they shared it, and they would read it over and over again, and they would share it with other people. We know about Paul's letters to the early church and how foundational those are, not only in our New Testament canon, but to the actual creation and formation of the body of Christ that developed over the years that followed Jesus. And so the power, and those early Greeks, those Greeks who were writing in Greek, the letter itself, the tangible document, was believed to be the very embodiment of the person, the author. And so when you remember that, I remember being taught that in seminary by one of my New Testament professors. When you read Paul's letters and how he speaks to the Philippians, for example, that the author is pouring himself out, in just as Jesus does in the Christ hymn, that the author's pouring himself out into this letter so that the reader, the ultimate reader and hearer, listener, the person who's spoken to, might also receive the presence of the author as well, and be welcomed by that presence, and to be shared, have a communal experience. This is deeply spiritual in its understanding. Now, I think there are still elements of that hang on to us for over time. And I think this time of year, at Christmas time, when we, as I talked about this morning a little bit, that this habit we have, or this beautiful practice we have of taking time to write a Christmas letter and sharing a year's worth of reflections and happenings and goings on, and identifying a list of people with whom it would be important to share that with, and then my practice of receiving those, that is as if I'm being visited by those people, even though I know I won't have a chance to see many of them in the course of this year, and many of them I didn't see in this year past. That presence of their efforts coming into my home and coming into my consciousness and coming into me dedicating that time to read that letter is so profound. And so we know letter writing carries particular weight, even in this day and age when we have so many other ways to communicate. Zoom being, one of the newest and the latest ways for us that we've been discovering this way to stay connected with one another, to share news, to learn from one another, that kind of stuff. And so that's our hope tonight, is to learn a little bit and share some stories. We have two storytellers on tap, but the floor will be open, assuming our two storytellers and I don't continue on and on and on, to share a little bit of their experience with the power of letter writing in particular. And this whole idea and genesis for this Going Deeper session kind of began because Carol shared with us, with the rest of the Adult Ed Committee, about her experiences with her parents. And that's as much as I'm going to offer as a way of an introduction. But Carol, would you kick us off and share some of the thoughts and reflections that you have about the letter writing that your parents engaged in?
Okay, well, my parents had written to each other from the time they were courting. They actually met. Can you hear me okay? Because I'm not lighting. Okay. They met while they were both teaching in Worthington. And then that summer they started writing to one another, and that turned into an engagement. And then they got married, of course. And then actually they got, or that their wedding invitations went out the Friday before Pearl Harbor Day.
Oh.
So, they were supposed to get married during Christmas vacation that year, and they, had to think about, were they really going to do this, or should they do this? And they decided, yes, like you say, life goes on. So they did, and then Dad thought maybe he would get a deferment as an agricultural teacher, because many of those were, but that didn't work out. They said, well, you're in too small of a town to do that, and whatever. So he went into the Army that summer, and then from then on, whenever they were apart, they wrote letters. He was in the States for most of the war, actually, because like he said, he didn't have very good eyesight, but eventually they got down to, you just give an extra pair or two of glasses and send you on your way. So he did eventually get overseas in 1945, so very close to the end, in the Pacific, in the Philippines, and then in Japan. He was told he was going to Japan 7 days after they dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. So, and by the beginning of October, they were on their way. So there were some interesting things. I mean, they decided to, when they were first writing letters especially during World War II, they decided they would write every day if they possibly could, with the idea that if you only write occasionally, you don't ever get too newsy, or the news just kind of skims. You don't hear the day-to-day stuff. So they made that promise to each other and pretty well stuck to it. And so lots of letters, a lot of information. Mother kept all of Dad's letters. The letters she wrote to him were kept while he was in country, but once he was overseas, most of those were lost, because he'd keep them in his footlocker, but when he'd have to move, he didn't have the space for them, so they got chucked. But it was very nice, because when he wrote his letters, when they would write to each other, it was kind of like a conversation. So he'd always write back, could be 2 or 3 weeks later, he'd write back what she had written. Oh, you were talking about this. And so there's a lot of details indirectly of what was going on in her life. And then they kept all these letters and told us that when after they had died, we would be getting them, and they were for us to read. And Mom passed away first when I was working in Hong Kong, and I think Dad was able, he would read those letters a lot. I know my brother has them, and he says that he made notes on each packet of letters when he last read them, because he was so lonely. And he also, at that time, did a little editing. He cut off the last parts of some of his letters that were getting too personal. He didn't even want us to read those. But there was enough romance and love expressed even in the parts that he left by long shot. But I've really enjoyed writing these. I mean, my excuse me, I'm typing these up. My brother Ron and I made the deal that he would scan them into his computer and send them to me, and then I'm typing them up, and then I send the typed version back, and he does some final editing, and he's going to be putting them in some kind of a collection for his kids. He's the only one in our family that has kids, so that the next generation can see those, perhaps. But what I've really enjoyed about them is to see my parents as people, beyond the parenting role. I see that a little bit, as my older brother John is a baby and being talked about, or my cousins when they were little, the oldest cousins. But to see them as a courting young couple and what they had to say, and some of their adventures. My mother was, when the summer that they were writing to each other, she and her sister, a mother was 26 and her sister was 18, I think. They rode their bikes from White Bear Lake up to Grand Marais and back, and around to Ely and all around and back, on gravel roads mostly, of course, and whatnot. And we're in the paper for doing this and all. They were very adventuresome. Mom learned how to fly when she was in Worthington. She didn't get as far as solo lessons because she had to stop and get married and never went on. But she did all the ground school stuff and worked at the airport. She worked on planes, and she did that a little bit during the war out of White Bear too. So just little interesting things like that. And my dad was a great writer. If you want me to read a part, I'll read one section where he tells about this terrible typhoon he was in on the way to Japan. So I can read that. That's not so private. They were supposed to go to Japan on LSTs in a convoy, and they had to try several times because they kept going out, and they would eventually, within a day or two, be turned back because of the storm. And so this is what he wrote in his first description of it. This is on from October 3rd in 1945. And he said they're still in the Philippines, and he thought he'd be halfway to Japan by then. But so he said that, let's see, where should I start? So we left Batangas at 0900 Saturday morning as scheduled, and had a fairly smooth ride up to the mouth of Manila Bay, where we picked up 9 more LSTs for our convoy. There were 8 of us that had left Batangas together. That was at 5 o'clock Saturday afternoon. And when those 9 joined us near Corregidor, then we proceeded on up the west coast of Luzon Saturday night and Sunday forenoon, with the going getting rougher and rougher. Finally, about 4 o'clock Sunday, we received our orders by radio to turn around and head back. We stayed here until Tuesday morning, and then we started out again. And once more, we got orders to turn back. And that was about 6 o'clock at night. And then down further, he says, so I've been mighty uncomfortable I've had some mighty uncomfortable hours the past few days. Seasick, of course. I was all right all day Saturday, but Sunday forenoon, I felt it coming on and I could only eat a couple mouthfuls for dinner. I lost that shortly afterwards and went to bed to stay there until Monday noon when we pulled into Subic Bay. I thought I was going to die Sunday night. The ship rocked and rolled and pitched until I was sure it was going to turn upside down and sink, and I didn't much care whether it did or not. The ship's crew said it was the roughest weather they had been through during the whole war. The waves washed up over the main deck, so you can imagine the size of them. These LSTs ride the wave instead of cutting through like other ships because they have such flat bottoms and small draft. That's what makes them so rough riding. It would roll from side to side at such dizzy angles. Every once in a while, the whole boat would shudder from stem to stern as it leaped through the air and into a solid wall of water. I was never quite so scared and quite so sick all at the same time. Honey, I don't know if you know what that seasick feeling is like, but it is awful. Imagine yourself on one of these worst kind of carnival rides that make you woozy in a couple of minutes, except this ride lasts for hours and days, and there's not a thing you can do about it. Your stomach feels like it's going to be torn out of you. You want to vomit. You have a terrible headache, and your muscles are all sore from clinging to your bunk and trying to keep yourself from rolling off. And at the same time, you're slowly starving to death. My footlocker floated around in my cabin like a magic carpet, and there were crashing sounds of all sorts coming from various parts of the ship as mess equipment and other articles went sailing through the air. I'm not exaggerating, honey. I've been through a lot of terrible Minnesota storms, but never anything like that. So they had come back to the Philippines, and a few days later, they started out again. And next letter, he writes about that. I looked it up. It was Typhoon Louise, but that didn't start until October 2nd, east of the Philippines, and then it went up and it kind of made a turn north of the Philippines and then up into Japan. So they were skirting along the thing the whole way to Japan. And so he was sick all the way to Japan. And the next letter is not quite as long as that section, but a lot of the same sort of thing of just how sick he was. And so for 4 or 5 days, he just lived on toast and water. It's all he could possibly get down. Anyway, so that's on World War II, and then just a word about letter writing later in my life. Excuse me, my throat. I've got a frog in my throat here. I was in Hong Kong for 3 years writing, and wrote a lot with my parents and the church and friends and everything. And I know what it's like to be far from home. And you're not returning for a long time, and when you're in such a different environment, how much letters mean to you. I mean, it was, you're really homesick, and it's the only time I've ever really felt homesick in my life was when I was in Hong Kong at first. And the letters were just so important. And luckily, Hong Kong had great mail service. They had delivery twice a day and once on Sunday. And then in Africa, it was the opposite. I was there for 7 years. I get home every other year. And it took 7 weeks for a letter to go one direction. So then you're talking about a 14-week return if you're quick at answering. And letter writing kind of went down the drain. I lost contact with a lot of people over those years because just too long between letters. It was really hard. So that's my story.
Well, Carol, thank you. Your father was a vivid describer. I mean, did you experience that from him in that level of detail? In the other letters as well, and in your life with him? Yeah,
sometimes. And actually, he never talked about the war. His war years much at all. But that was one story he did tell, was this unforgettable seasickness that he had, and the whole ship just shuddering and feeling sure he was going to die. That was That was it. But he never had much else to say. My mother told me a bit more, but not a whole lot. I mean, she once mentioned that he worked with, he was in command of a black troop when he was in the Philippines and in Japan. He did motor pool work, keeping things in shape. They were building roads in the Philippines, and then built the airport, or updated the airport so that our planes could come in Tokyo, is what they were doing.
And the whole volume of material that you and your brother are pulling together, and you're transcribing, how many total pieces are involved in this effort?
Oh, I can't count them. I mean, it's from June of 1941 until almost June 1945, with about a 1 year in between missing, because mother was able to live with him in San Antonio when he was down there. So probably all, let's see, it's not, there's probably about, well, I'm sure there's a good 1,000 letters. I still have,
Wow.
I'm up to, what am I up to? Let's see, I'm in Japan right now, and let's see, movie over to the notebook. I just finished October 25th, and I think my brother said they go until the spring of 45. So I still have about 6 months to go yet.
Hmm. Wow. Well, thank you for that. Any other questions for Carol? And then we'll let Esther tell her story. Esther, I just want to give you the heads up. I muted you during Carol's talk there, just because we were picking up a fair amount of sound from you. And so when you want to speak, you'll want to unmute yourself again. So by clicking that button in the lower corner. Yeah. So Gary's got a question.
Yeah, I just have a question for Carol. When you're through putting all these letters together and getting them typed and organized, have you ever thought about approaching the Minnesota Historical Society and see if they might like to have that collection?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would do that, but I think that would have to be a decision my brothers and I would have to make, and we would actually be going against what was the message that was left to us in writing with the letters that these are for our family only.
Yeah.
Actually, they said specifically John, Ron, and Carol, but we have decided that can mean, 1 or 2 cousins that are really close, or like Ron's kids eventually. I mean, it doesn't have to stop at us 3, but yeah, family. So I don't think we will.
Okay.
But yeah.
But that's a really good family history, part of your family history. I mean, to share with other members of the family too. I mean, I would think the cousins and whoever would appreciate reading them.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. I think it should be a little broader than just us 3 by any means. And another thing too, another war story you could say is when I was in college. That was during the Vietnam War, and my cousin, who was in Vietnam as a mechanic for helicopter service, wrote to me, and he wrote. I mean, he just poured his heart out. He was just so, depressed, sometimes with his friends being killed. You know how helicopter pilots had very short lives, almost suicidal, thinking he would, he thought about volunteering to be on the helicopters just to get it over with, sort of thing, being shot at in camp and whatnot. And I've kept those letters too. And just, yeah, it's something to be able to read stuff like that.
Yeah.
Your cousin survived the war though, or okay?
I did. I mean, yes, he did.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. 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 Wonderful. Well, thanks, Carol. Esther, we'd love to hear your story, but again, down in the lower left-hand corner, you're going to want to find that little mute button and check it, and just open it up. Not there yet. It's going to have a line through it. It's like a little microphone icon with a line through it. You just want to click on that. There you go. Now you're open.
Am I open?
You are.
Oh,
we can hear you fine.
Well, I have a bit of a war theme as well. To start with, most of this is about my mother and how that impacted me, I should say. My mother from Norway, of all things, actually was 40 when I was born. She came in her late 20s and ultimately met my father in Brooklyn, where they both were at that time. And of all things, she gave birth to me on the 5th of April. And on the 9th of April, the Nazis invaded Norway, her beloved home. And I'm thinking of that every once in a while as you think about having a child, and good grief, all of that was happening for her. She didn't speak to it, but I knew it. I mean, I was told. Yeah, and so early on in my life, I remember her well. She had of course, but I remember her taking her little portable typewriter from the little case, putting it on the kitchen table and typing and typing and typing and typing. She had many sisters and brothers in Norway. She was the only one that ventured here. And she and her best friend did that for an adventure. She was an independent woman before that was even noted to be known. She was great. And so there they were. And she wrote home to her own mother as well. Her father had long been gone by then. But that's how, that's what I was observing as a really little kid. And so ultimately, as time went on, she decided it would be good to take me to Norway to introduce me. By then I was 10, which is a great age for remembering and knowing and understanding. And that is where I learned to speak Norwegian, because in those years, so long ago, my first cousins who I met, who are, still my first cousins, were my age, but they hadn't been taught English. So I had no choice. If I was going to play with them, and I certainly was, we were there all summer, that summer. And I learned to speak Norwegian. And the Norwegian in my head is still a 10-year-old's Norwegian, which is unfortunate. However, that's just how it goes. I can't help it. I don't have anyone to practice with on a day-to-day basis. And now when I go to Norway, which I do frequently, I'm told just speak in English. Here, Norwegian's terrible. Yeah, very, very forthright first cousins of mine. Yeah, I love them all. So that's what started me in letter writing. Of course, then I had all my first cousins to write to. And they weren't so great about writing back because they didn't know English. And ultimately, years went by a bit, and I said to them, I can read Norwegian. You just write me in Norwegian. I'll write you in English now that you're learning it. And so that's what has transpired in our adulthood, fortunately. And when I go to visit, they also say, don't bother with Norwegian, it's awful. Just speak English. So we're in good shape, really good shape. Oh, it's just been so much fun. Then I also, in addition to having people in Norway to write to, first cousins and uncles and aunts and so forth, I also, because of my father's business, he was a Lutheran pastor, moved from where I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, to Philadelphia. And so then, I had friends that I left behind. It seemed like all the time, because after Philadelphia, where I made more good friends, then we moved to North Iowa, where I kind of stayed actually, and ultimately went to high school there. And from there, then left home, went to college. So I had friends to write to, and I still have written. There are a few that we still are in touch with by writing notes and letters. And so my MO really is to send a note, write a card or whatever, whatever is appropriate to current friends and relatives. My father's family is in this country, but both of his parents also came from Norway. So I have that bunch over there as well that I have found and met. Yeah. And we also write to each other. Those who do email, and not everyone does yet, and maybe never will, do email me, which is, and I back. I mean, that's another format now that I appreciate. So ultimately, that's sort of my letter writing story, and I will likely continue as long as I can. Yeah, just fun to think about.
Thank you, Esther. I too have a great aunt who, though born here in the United States, her Norwegian parents, and they only spoke Norwegian at home on the farm out in western Minnesota. And so she, for her whole life, corresponded with the first cousins back in Norway, and in Norwegian. And whenever I, as a child, remember going over to her house. She lived here in Minneapolis, and very consistent thing would be that my Auntie Dell, who our daughter Della is named after, Auntie Dell would pull out the latest letter from Roros that had come,
right.
and she would update, my mom, and she'd be reading the Norwegian, but she'd be translating as she was going, and this, the little stories that they would tell. It was all about people, of course, and so did this, and so did this, and I didn't know any of these people, so I was bored, right, as a little kid, and that kind of thing. But it was just really an important part of my great aunt's life that she maintained these connections. Never had the chance to travel to Norway in her life. Never had the chance to spend any time with these cousins that she was corresponding with, but knew them intimately.
Yeah.
Because of that letter writing, because of that practice of the continual back and forth and the updating and the cherishing of tradition and story, that, and here she was sharing it with me, and whatever, like I was a 10-year-old who didn't care for that kind of stuff or whatever. But anyway, so your story lines up so beautifully with
one
a treasured
last little thing. Could I?
Yeah.
One more little thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've recently gotten a letter in English, of course, and typed, but sent in the mail of all things. She does email. I don't know why this happened, but it did. And just because it's fun for me, in Norway, my full name is always used, my first and second. It's Barrett, so it's Esther Barrett. And so her heading is Kjære, which means dear, Esther Barrett. There you go. Mm-hmm. And she ends with, and this would be typical, en stor klem fra, and then her name is Kari. En stor klem means a big hug.
Oh.
Isn't that great? It just sounds so much more fun in Norwegian. For me.
That's delightful. Oh, anyone have a question for Esther tonight? Steve?
Well, I wasn't going to ask a question.
Well,
so if anybody does have a question,
yeah, anybody
I do have something else. If somebody has something for Esther, great. Otherwise, I had something else to.
Looks like the mic is yours, Steve. Go ahead.
Okay. Several years ago, I participated in a group of about probably 40 men that were part of a group called Letters from Dad, and it was mainly the program or the idea kind of started by a person whose father died, And after his father died, he had nothing from his father.
Oh.
And he had nothing. His father had not been very affirming and had not been, helped build him up. And so he decided that he wanted to encourage men, in this case, to write letters to spouse and parents and children at key times in their life, or that with just a sense of expressing the love, the appreciation, affirmation of certain characteristics. And so this group of men that I was a part of met for probably 8 weeks, six or eight sessions. And there was a book that went with it. There was some, some suggestions for things that could be considered in the writing. And it was just a real positive thing. And I think I've kind of stuck with that. And occasionally, not often anymore, but occasionally on Christmas, or when my kids have gotten married, I wrote a letter both to them and their spouse, and just affirmation and blessing. And I think that's been meaningful. And I think the fascinating thing was when I was reading the book entitled Letters from Dad, I was on the plane and flying, and I was reading, and all of a sudden I realized that the woman sitting next to me was reading over my shoulder, or from, and she was kind of following along, and she said, I've got to get that book for my husband. and just that sense. So I thought that was just a powerful thing, that letters can help leave a bit of a legacy, or that, and both Esther and Carol have talked about building relationships with letters and holding on of relationships. And I think there are things we can do without necessarily having to do as faithful and as committed as you have shown, Esther, or Carol, your parents showed, but
Yeah.
occasionally to put something in writing that I think can be affirmation and just reinforcement of positive characteristics and appreciation for people in our lives.
Thanks, Steve. Kent.
What was the name of that book?
Unmute. Letters from Dad, and I'm trying to remember the author, and I can't remember it offhand, but the title of the book is Letters from Dad.
Wouldn't be too hard to find. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, that's neat. Yeah, wonderful. Anyone else have a story of letter writing or an experience with letter writing that they would like to share with us tonight?
Well, I can just for fun. I sort of have been a letter writer. Dale and I started doing Christmas letters just because we have spread out family. We have a lot of college friends hither and yon. And we, I believe, wrote our first Christmas letter in 1966, just as Dale was going into the military, drafted and heading off to officers training. And we did a letter in 1968 when he was in Korea and I was at home. So it was a two-part letter. And we have them all. So that's kind of how we begin our Christmas season, is kind of sitting down and looking at them every year and seeing what happened. It helps us keep track of how our life has gone, and has been a fun way for us to begin our holiday season. I think the other fun part is I did a back in the old LCW days with the church women, I did a trip to Brazil for 2 weeks and stayed with two families. Neither one of them, where the women in the family spoke English, and only one husband did a little. But we managed, and the kids were a little better, not much. As you might guess, Portuguese for someone who's lived in Minnesota more than half of their life is not real common. And I can remember sitting down at the typewriter in one of those houses to send a note back to Dale, to mail a letter back to Dale. And I am typing away, and the woman in the house comes and says, "My typewriter has never typed English."
Oh.
We laughed about it, and we still laugh about she did, and they had English in school up until high school, but then, like Esther says, if you have no one to talk to, you really don't do much anymore. And so, when we're there, we certainly can communicate now because they have a little more English, but it just has been such fun. And when she first wrote letters back to me, she would have her friend who was an English teacher translate them. And then for a while, they came in this really kind of Portuguese, German, English that made sense. And now they're very fine. They come by email, and her granddaughter does them. So, it sounds like Marlene, but you can tell Anna Flavia did it because it's shifted personality a little. But it's been great fun for us to keep in touch with her. And we had a Swedish exchange student who lived with us in 1974 that we still hear from now by email. But letters are important no matter how they come, I think.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Renita. Yeah, what a gift.
And-
Gary,
and I'm glad
Gary or
I'm-
Jean?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that you were going to do this, because I thought, oh, that'd be fun. I could listen to
Well,
that. So thank you for letting me be here.
Christmas letter season, and I certainly have gotten some inspiration tonight, or encouragement to not let that one slip through the fingers this year. I did it last year, so I'm hopeful I'll pull it off again this year. Gary, did you have something that you wanted to add? I saw that your microphone opened, and so wasn't sure if that.
No, I don't. No, I've never been much of a letter writer, and that's true of my whole family. We just never wrote letters. My grandmother Olson, who spoke fluent Swedish and wrote Swedish, would write to her husband's relatives in Sweden. And when she died, of course, all that ended. But in terms of my own letter writing, I'm a failure.
There's still hope. There's still hope for you, Gary.
So email has been a good boon for me.
Carol's trying to get our attention, and I think Diane, maybe you've turned your camera on because perhaps you wanted to add something. So Carol, and then Diane.
I just Googled real fast letters from Dad, and it's Greg Vaughn is the
Okay. Yeah.
Eughn.
Thank you.
Diane,
Diane, do you have something you wanted to share with us?
Yes, several years ago, I came across a book called Frontier Mother, which are letters by Gro Svensson, a woman in southern Minnesota. And I was reading parts of it. And one letter that was dated August 16th, 1870, I'm reading along this letter, and she tells about what's going on here to her relatives in Norway. And then there's a PS. It said, Lars Lillehaugen was here and sent greetings home. Well, that was my great grandfather. and I did
Oh.
not expect to find him in this book. So he came from the same place in Norway and ended up in southern Minnesota, evidently. So I copied the letter and I gave it to my sister to read. And she came across a paragraph that says in the same letter, I promised Asser Olsen Nasbo that I would send you greetings when I wrote to you. He came here to his sister's home in the middle of July. He and his family are well and getting along fine. Their journey across the ocean was very strenuous as they encountered many storms. He is staying with his sister. She helped him get started on his own, giving him a cow. Well, my sister read that. That was her husband's great grandfather. So our great grandfather,
Come on.
her husband and ours, I mean, her husband's great grandfather and ours came evidently from the same neighborhood in Norway and ended up in Minnesota. And when my brother-in-law died 2 years ago, from that one cow that his sister gave him, the family owned 7 farms around Jackson, Minnesota. I just think that's kind of a cool thing to be able to read in a book.
Fantastic.
Very cool indeed. Yes.
Oh.
Wow, that's awesome.
Oh.
I wonder, it makes one think, do you think, aside from, the people you're corresponding with, to be mentioned in someone else's letter, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, I'm sure you all write letters about how wonderful the sermon was in church this morning, and how, those make the big news, of course, right? Garrison Keeler is always writing about the sermon he hears in Lake Wobegon, and so anyways, but
a whole book. This is a whole book of her letters. And
Frontier Mother.
I'm sure she wrote and carried messages from lots of people to their families in Norway. That was an interesting, I don't know how often my great grandfather wrote, although we do have a Bible that his mother sent to him, and he came to the US alone, but his mother sent him the family Bible, and in it was a letter in Norwegian, which none of us could read until I went to St. Olaf and I took it to the Norwegian department and had it translated. Anyway, she said, it does an old mother's heart good to have you ask for the family Bible. And then she goes on and gives him a lot of motherly advice, which is another cool letter to have from, that would have been from my great grandmother in Norway. Yeah.
That's a wonderful exercise to do for I know that many an English teacher or creative writing teacher has encouraged their students to write a letter to your younger self, offering advice, for the things that you've learned in the whatever past period of time, or write a letter to your future self and express your aspirations and hopes and that kind of thing, or your children, or your imagined children or your grandchildren or something like that. So someday when I have some time, I'll do that.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Steve.
A favorite Christmas letter story was the year my nephew complained about how all these letters came telling about aches and pains and this and that, and or else bragging about everything that, just over the top. And so the next Christmas, I wrote a single letter just to him, but put it in the format of a group letter, a Christmas letter. And I did everything he had complained about, and just, but made it close enough to the truth so that it wasn't quite so obvious. And he got the letter, and he went to my sister and said, "Did you get Steve's Christmas letter? What did you think?" Well, she had gotten a different one, and she, of course, responded, "Well, I thought it was okay. I didn't really notice it." Oh, so we finally let him know and figured it out.
The genre is practical jokes as letter writing.
That's right. That's right.
For sure that happens. So Carol, did you have something else?
I just wanted to ask Diane, who is the author of the Frontier Letters book?
Yeah.
It's Letters of Gro Svensson, translated by Pauline Farseth and Theodore Blagan. It's Norwegian American Historical Society published.
Probably out of print, but probably available at the library.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, it's a 1950s publication, so it's not as old as the letter.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, remarkable. Well, Kent, you have something to share.
Just one, I haven't read them for a long time. We've done Christmas letters every year, and we have one copy stored away. It'd be fun to read those sometime. But long before computers were around and before Xerox machines, my siblings and I would use carbon paper on a typewriter to make several copies.
Yeah.
Then we'd always keep one when we would send it around and send everybody the same letter. But with Xerox machines, that disappeared, and then email and other things. There's a whole early history or a process that just isn't there anymore.
It's true.
I don't know that I lament not having to worry about carbon paper and
I know.
I'll confess.
Yeah.
Now I do have a lament. My wife's cooking dinner and our smoke alarm's going on.
I
So
see.
the story I want to tell is about my wife, in the sense that like Carol as parents, their early courtship, our courtship was mediated over long distances. When Ann and I met, we were camp counselors together out in Montana, but I was still in school in New York, and Ann was still in Montana, and so our early courtship, and this is pre-internet. I mean, our kids can't fathom it, but and phone calls were expensive back then, and so my practice at the time was to go to the campus bookstore on about a weekly basis, and I would buy all of the greeting cards from the romantic section, right? All the missing you cards and all the that stuff, and I would scribble a little note. Sometimes I would just sign my name, but I would send one almost every day. And to her credit, she actually took some time and wrote some longer notes, and I did as well on occasion. But the volume was significant and filled a considerable couple of shoeboxes full of correspondence between the two of us in our early years, because we had a couple of years of long distance relationship that we had to mediate primarily through the mail, and when we could afford it, over the telephone, and then when we really could afford it, the occasional trip. And would come out to New York to see me or something like that. But those were really a treasured keepsake, treasured so much that we put them in a special place inside our barn out in Montana, where we kept all the important papers. And I started storing some of the financial records from the restaurant and things like that. And then our tenants, we had a bunkhouse, that makes it sound really fancy, on our property. And I rented that to some staff member, and they asked if they could raise chickens in our barn over the winter. And I said, yeah, that'd be fine, and then the heat lamp that they used to keep the chicken coop warm sparked or something, and the barn burnt down, and along with it, all of the a lot of stuff the only thing that really to this day sort of still stings a little bit is the loss of that box of correspondence that we exchanged and hung on to over all these years. And, well, all those years. It's been a number of years now since those have been gone, and so, but now we got a good story to tell, and so that's almost as good, right?
Right.
So,
I got one more little story.
yeah, kid.
It's not a whole chain of letters, but it's just one. That in 77, I was wandering around the world some through Africa and India and Ceylon and Thailand, Hong Kong, Japan, and I took a cruise ship to Russia. I got a typhoon story too.
Ooh.
Never been as sick as that. But then the train across Russia, and this was 2 or 2.5 months of being on my own in strange territory. And in the telegraph was I almost want to say American Express, but that's not right. But you could
Western
not
Union.
only send, you could not only send telegraphs, but they would receive written letters and hold them for these travelers coming through. You could go there. Do you have anything for Kent Olson?
Oh,
I found out where they were. Many times, nope, sorry. But I got one in Moscow. I remember. I got more too, but in Moscow it was from my mother, and then going to Red Square right outside the Kremlin and reading it.
ooh.
Telling about what's happening at home. I was transported back. I was getting a little emotional right now.
Yeah.
There's a power in those letters, well before email. Mainframes were still the big thing back then.
That's right.
Yeah.
So to have this paper letter far from home.
Well, the year
Diane-
we lived in Sweden was 92, and that was the first time we had exposure to the fax machine. And those faxes that we got were very important because we could get this more immediate response than these letters that would take a week at that time to get almost and stuff. So I think we've got all those fax letters
Somewhere.
someplace. So.
Not in the chicken barn, no.
Well, and I
Diane, I'm going to offer you the last word or the next to last word tonight. So
Okay, well, this is not a letter writing, but from the historical point of view, I always think without letters, what are future biographers and historians going to use as their original sources? Because those letters provide so many details that authors could use, and emails are gone.
It's true.
well, they're gone, and yet they still somehow continue to exist, in
If the
ether.
government wants
Somewhere.
I certainly don't imagine that every email you've ever written has now disappeared, because it's out there somewhere. So anyways, Vernita, did you wave just as I was
Well, I was just going to say when Dale and I were writing this joint Christmas letter from Korea and from here when he was in the service, we did reel-to-reel tapes too.
Oh,
And so, you had an audio letter, but this is long before you could make telephone calls and do that. So that was kind of an interesting way to communicate in addition to written letters.
one of the treasures in my parents' collection is a cassette tape that was recorded at their dinner table in 1971, 72, when I was an infant. And it was a tape that they had just recorded the dinner conversation, and they were sending that to my parents, to my grandparents, so that they could sort of, experience dinner life at our dinner table or whatever. I'm just banging my spoon on my high chair. I didn't say much in the thing, but they talk about me in the tape anyway. So it's a really treasured thing. So, and that went in the mail, right? That had to go, and who knows how long it took in 1971 to send a cassette tape from Northern Germany back to the United States and Minnesota back then. But anyway, so what a gift this time was together with all of you. Esther and Carol in particular, thank you for your stories tonight, and to all of you for sharing your experiences. Hopefully you've been inspired to sit down as I have and write this year's Christmas letter. And dig out the address lists and find stamps and all of that, and use the U.S. Postal Service to help carry out and this tradition. And we'll see if we can't keep that going. So, thank you all for your time tonight. Great to go deeper with all of you this evening.
That's great.
Blessings on your night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank